Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Andrew Dalton with the Adams County Historical Society here in Gettysburg, PA. And I'm joined by my good friend, Brad Gottfried. I've known Brad for many years, and he's been so helpful with all that we're doing here at the Historical Society. And I have to say, just to tell a quick story, one of Brad's books, Brigades of Gettysburg, was one of the first books I ever read about the Battle of Gettysburg. I was in middle school, and I remember carrying the big book around in my backpack and trying to cram it into the bag at the end of every class. But I learned so much from that, and I've learned a lot from working with Brad and with his wife, Linda, over the past couple of years through the Historical Society. So I should also introduce what we are doing here. So we are a small organization, a grassroots organization, trying to do something really big. And we're actually building a new museum and archives here just north of town on the edge of the battlefield. That'll open sometime next year. We're hoping early in the early spring or even late winter. So if you want to check out the Adams County Historical Society, I hope you'll visit our website and like our Facebook page for frequent updates and posts that we put up every day with historic photos and artifacts from our collection. Also wanted to thank the Dobbin House Tavern. The Dobbin House sponsors all of our programs, and we're so grateful for their generosity. And many of you, no doubt, have been to the Dobbin House and have enjoyed the food and the atmosphere there. And finally, we do have a donate button on the post. If you'd like to support the Adams County Historical Society tonight, I encourage you to do so. It takes a lot to put together this program series, but we have a small and wonderful staff that works really hard, and we'll put those donations right toward putting on more and more programs for you every week. And then without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker, who I already alluded to, Brad Gottfried, who is earned a PhD and served as a college president at two different institutions and retired in 2017. He's now a Gettysburg licensed town guide and a licensed battlefield guide at Antietam, which is a great program that I encourage you to visit Antietam and take advantage of. And he's written 14 books on the Civil War, including the one in my hand right here, Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg, which is going to be the topic of our discussion tonight. And I have posted a link to this book in the post above the video this evening. So I hope that you will check the book out and learn more about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. So tonight's program is a little different than past weeks because we're going to do more of a discussion. And we've had a lot of questions already submitted by our members and our Facebook audience. So I'm going to get to some of those questions, but I also want to encourage you to leave questions in the comments tonight. I'm going to try to monitor them on my phone and direct them to Brad as we continue the program. So please don't be shy if you have any questions about Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, anything that we cover or don't cover this evening. I hope you'll put it in the comments so that we can talk about it. So let me start, Brad, with just asking you about your own background and how you got interested and became a Civil War historian and author, and kind of your methodology for how you approach these different topics that you've written about.
Okay, well, thank you, Andrew. It's great to contribute to the Historical Society in a variety of different ways, so thank you for the opportunity. I'm a person that became interested in the Civil War probably when I was about 13 years old. My brother was very interested in it, and I was emulating him. And it really started from there. I went off to college, packed up all my books, and just forgot about the Civil War. I was pre-med at the time. And I got back to Philadelphia. That's where I actually grew up. When I was in my 30s, I had already had my doctorate. I was a professional at that point in higher education. Got back to Philadelphia. I said, I wonder what's in these books that I would bring with me, about a dozen boxes of books, never opened them. And I just became interested again in the Civil War. And for me, as a scientist, I didn't go into I didn't go into medicine. I became a zoologist, and I taught and then was an administrator, as you mentioned, Andrew. But I've always brought my scientific background to my research. It's a different way of looking at it. I think it's a little bit critical. Not to say that historians don't use critical thinking skills, but that's something that's very, very important. The scientific method, the law of Occam is very important to scientists. So whenever I write a book, or research a book, I'm looking at it at a variety of different ways. One is using those critical thinking skills, and I'm very organized in that regard. I like to compartmentalize. And number two, I'm an educator. And I have to tell you, I struggled in school. I was not a very good student when I was K through 12. And I think because I struggled, I want to make sure I can empathize, I think, with the reader. I want to make sure that I'm putting myself in their shoes when I read a book such as Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg. A lot of people know about the topic, but I want it to be not only informative, but just fun to read. And it's part of the Emerging Civil War series, so they require a lot of maps, a lot of photographs, a lot of graphics. In fact, every page has one or two, and it really makes it more interesting. So it was an interesting journey. And as you know, Andrew, I do not ever portray myself as an expert on Lincoln. I jump around. I just finished a book that is coming out very soon on Lincoln, Lee's two invasions of the North. My Maps of Spotsylvania book should be out this year. So I jump around from topic to topic, never really concentrating on any one in particular.
Right. Yeah. And I think it was really great what you said about being an organized writer and compartmentalizing things to kind of help the reader digest the information. I think Brigades of Gettysburg is a great example of that because it's just such a novel approach to kind of break down everything that's happening into every brigade story from start to finish, and then kind of being able to weave all of that together after you kind of read through the whole thing. I really enjoyed that approach. And also in maps, of course, to have, and they kind of go together, I think, as you probably intended. But how did you come up with the idea to kind of break down such a really complicated topic and confusing topic like the Battle of Gettysburg into kind of a digestible method like that?
Well, for me, it's interesting. Whatever I do, it sort of evolves. So I never sit down and say, there's a market for this, or it's more, what am I interested in? You know, what has not been studied to any great degree. So for instance, Gettysburg, I started off with revising a tour guide that was many, many years old. It's still in print. It's Stackpole and Nye, even before you were born, probably, Andrew. When I was 13 during the centennial, there it was all by itself. And then that led to an interest in the Philadelphia Brigade and its history, especially what they did at Gettysburg. Roads to Gettysburg, it led to the maps of Gettysburg, led to the artillery, because I realized how important the artillery was. And then obviously the brigades of Gettysburg, because there was never quite a reference work that looked at each unit. You know, for instance, in the wheat field, you have de Trobriand's brigade, but what did it do when it pulled out? What was it doing before? What was it like on the march, et cetera? And so it really tries to weave these little known pieces of information together.
Right. Yeah, I think it's excellent. And again, I encourage people to, if you're kind of starting, even if you're kind of in the intermediate understanding of the battle, it's just a great way to think about everything and to piece things together without perhaps reading the very long books like Coddington, which of course have their own unique value, but it's definitely more digestible, I think, to look at it in an organized fashion like that. So let me get into some of the questions about the book. And again, the book is called Lincoln Comes to Gettysburg. It is brand new, 2021, I believe, Savas Beatty. And so this is definitely kind of it was a different project for you, I'd imagine, because you're not really looking at a battle, you're looking at an event and a speech and a president.
That's right.
So let me actually, before we get into the audience questions, what was the impetus for choosing this topic?
Well, a couple things. One, as you mentioned, Andrew, I'm a licensed town guide, and I love telling stories. I love walking around the town and really showing our visitors how unique this town is. And you know, so many people come because of the battle and the battlefield, but to show them that the civilian experience, the Black African-American experience, the founding of Gettysburg, I mean, fascinating. And one of our more popular tours is Lincoln.
Mhm.
And there's a lot on Lincoln, almost as much as on Gettysburg. But most of the books relating to Lincoln and Gettysburg tend to be fairly thick.
Mhm.
And I think it intimidates a lot of people. Do I really want to wade through a 400-page book? I have a passing interest in Lincoln and Gettysburg. So this one, as you held up, I mean, we're talking about 165 pages with lots of illustrations in it. And it just was, for me, it was a way to say, how do I learn more about his visit, about the Gettysburg Address, so I can be more effective as a tour guide, and also help people who aren't coming to Gettysburg to read more about it and learn more about, what he did, why the cemetery was established. I mean, it's a fascinating story.
Right. Yeah, it really is. And I think in a sense, the battle kind of overshadows what in any other community would be the central story, which is a president's visit and, arguably the most famous speech in American, if not world history.
Yes.
So before I go into the audience questions, we do have a comment. Joshua says, Brad's book was my first book on the Civil War when I was 6. I haven't stopped since.
That's wonderful. Thank
That's
you.
great. So let me get into a few of the questions that were submitted earlier through our website and on Facebook. So, and you touched on this just briefly in your last statement. This person's asking that the Gettysburg Address was given at the dedication of the cemetery, but what were the circumstances behind establishing the cemetery? And that's something that you touched on a lot in the book, I know. But could you set up a little bit the history of how the cemetery came to exist and the lead up to, of course, the famous event?
Oh, yes, it's my pleasure. In fact, there are a couple of heroes in this book that don't get the kind of credit that they should. One is the governor at the time. His name is Andrew Curtin. He was in his 40s, about 46 years old. He was a war governor, obviously, who cared deeply about the civilians and the citizens of not only Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. He played such a major role. The other is David Wills, who was really he was the driving force behind the whole thing. But it really begins with obviously with the battle. It begins with almost 8,000 dead men lying in the fields. It's a story of how do we get these men under cover, buried or embalmed and sent home, but more likely to be buried because of the health issues, because of just humanity. You don't want to leave them out there in the hot sun, all bloated and burned, etc. And so when Andrew Curtin came, and it was about a week after the battle was over on the 10th of July, he came around, he visited the battlefield, but especially he wanted to see the town. And as he walked around the town, he talked to a lot of townspeople to find out what were you experiencing. There was people were starting to become ill from all the vermin that were going from these bodies that were not buried properly into the town, infecting individuals.
Right.
And so he's really the driving force, he and Wills, to get this national cemetery formed, because the bodies, yes, they were being buried, but they were really not being buried as satisfactorily as they should have been. And so that gave birth to the cemetery and ultimately to its dedication to Lincoln coming. It's all about the dead bodies.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an important story that doesn't get a lot of attention. A community of just a couple thousand people dealing with, I guess you could say 7,000 to 10,000 bodies and twice as many wounded. It is kind of astounding that Gettysburg could survive that kind of a hit, both economically, from a health standpoint, and in addition to surviving, to actually put together this coalition to not only form the Cemetery Association, but also the preservation of the battlefield by the GBMA. So
right.
It's kind of remarkable, and something you don't see at other sites like Vicksburg or Sharpsburg, Maryland. Gettysburg really, I think, took on that national responsibility
Very
that
much so.
people look to this place to see that kind of effort. So the next question is, obviously, Wills, who you talked about, extended the invitation to Lincoln to come here. This person's asking if you think people were surprised by Lincoln's interest in the ceremonies and surprised that he actually made the trip here to dedicate the cemetery.
Yeah, these are all great questions. I appreciate them. Keep them coming. We are spoiled today. You know, Biden and Trump and all of our presidents in recent times, they were out and about. You know, they're in San Francisco, they're in Pittsburgh, they're in Cleveland, et cetera, or overseas. During the Civil War, and that whole era, travel was difficult. You know, the trains were not reliable, and it was very uncommon for any president, to leave Washington.
Right.
So for him to leave was very unusual. But what I always emphasize is I show photographs on my tours of what Lincoln looked like before he assumed the presidency, during that time, and in 1865, you can see how he wore the death of every young man on his face and his heart, et cetera. And, there's no question in my mind, and he was very clear about this with his wife, Mary, and with others, he had to come to Gettysburg to explain the sacrifice. He was getting a lot of pressure. So many young men were coming home. If they were coming home, many of them would never come home, but so many were coming home maimed, would never be the same. Why? Why are we continuing to fight? He felt that he needed to justify that, and also to sanctify the burial site, and to essentially thank the soldiers for what they had performed. So it was unusual, but it's not surprising. And what's even more surprising, though, is his personal life. And I'll wait if there's a question about that, how he almost didn't come because of some personal problems that he was having with his own family.
That's right. Actually, I do have a question here about Tad, his son,
Yes.
and Tad's illness that, like you said, nearly prevented Lincoln's attendance at the ceremony. Maybe you could touch on that a little bit, and kind of the pressures that were obviously present in his mind at that time. Before you do, one of my favorite quotes I just pulled up here is from Gates Fonestock, who was 10. He said, "It was the face I saw, sad, deeply lined, and earnestly thoughtful. The spirit of the man was what I seemed to see." And Liberty Hollinger, who's 17 at the time, wrote, "The chief impression made on me as a child was of the inexpressible sadness of his face."
Right.
So, like you said, I mean, it's amazing what especially children who were there that day picked up on. But obviously, in addition to all of the nation's struggles, he's dealing with an enormous personal crisis with the sickness of Tad. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly.
And while you do, I'm going to pull an artifact that I have behind me that
okay.
I forgot to bring over that relates to this story.
All right, sounds good. So many of us have heard the story of Mary Lincoln and how she may have had some serious emotional issues later on in life. But we need to think about what she had to go through and what he had to go through, Lincoln, when he was alive. He actually had a child by the name of Everett, who died at the age of, he was almost 4 years old in 1850. They think it was cancer. And then not even a year and a half before, Willie, who's about 12 years old, is going to die probably of typhoid fever. So he's already lost 2 of his 4 children. And let me step back and say, before he accepted the invitation, he actually was going to bring Tad and Mary with him, and maybe even Robert. They were going to make it a family vacation, so to speak, get away from the White House. He said to Mary, I've been working so hard, you barely see me. Why don't we all go to Gettysburg? We'll spend some time together. And what happens then is Tad comes down with probably a form of smallpox called variola. It's a mild form, but he's very, very sick. So think about this. You're Mary Lincoln. You've agreed that, yeah, we'll all go with you to Gettysburg, but you've lost already two sons and a third, little Tad, who's, I mean, we're talking what, 5, 6 years old, could be on his deathbed. And Mary is saying, how can you go? How can you leave your son, your youngest son, behind? You've already lost two of them. So she was beside herself. And his response was, Mary, I have to do this. This is something that I just can't not do this. And so he went, despite the fact that he knew that she was very, very upset with him. He was very upset. In fact, when he gets to Gettysburg on the evening of the 18th of November, he's very relieved when there's a knock on the door and a telegram arrives to tell him that Tad is doing much better. But, you know, Tad could have died.
Yeah.
And I don't know what would have happened, you know, to Lincoln, to his marriage, et cetera, at that point. Right. So that was a real sacrifice that he had to make to even journey to Gettysburg for this special event.
Sure. It's funny, we did not plan this at all in advance, but I have an artifact that is exactly related to what Brad was talking about. This is something that we actually found in our collection here. Again, we have millions of records and artifacts here at the Historical Society in Gettysburg. But this is actually, it's hard to see, I know, over Zoom, but they're notes from an interview that was conducted in 1925. A student at Gettysburg College who grew up in Gettysburg actually walked around the town and interviewed people about their remembrances of Lincoln. Mm-hmm. And it's from her thesis that she wrote at the college, but we have her interview notes. And the first note is an interview with her own grandfather, who was in Company B, 21st Pennsylvania Cavalry. And here's what the note says. Grandpa was encamped at Hers Ridge on the Chambersburg Pike, and they were brought in as orderlies for the occasion of the 19th. Grandpa was an orderly, and between 11 and 12 a.m. on the 19th carried a dispatch to Lincoln at the Wills Building on horseback. And then she says, he called at Wills Building and David Wills answered the door and wanted the dispatch, but Grandpa said he had orders to deliver it to Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln came to the door. Grandpa saluted and handed him the dispatch. Mr. L said there would be no reply. So this is the famous, you know, relaying of this message that Tad is doing better. But it's just fascinating to me that the granddaughter of that soldier kept these notes from her interview in 1925 and then donated them to the Historical Society here.
That is neat.
That's the connection we have to the past, which is kind of remarkable. So that's a great part of the story. We've touched on that. We've got lots of questions coming in here. So I see there's one about the famous myth that the address was written on the back of an envelope. Which is it's a fun story, but maybe you could touch on that myth and what you were able to uncover about kind of the origin of that part of the story.
You know, it's funny, Andrew, when I talk to younger people like yourself, and I mention that story, they look at me like I've got 4 heads. But being older, I'm familiar with that story. It really it started with a short story by Mary Shipman Andrews. We're talking about the early part of the 1900s. And people my age and maybe a little bit around my age know the myth that he wrote the Gettysburg Address on the train, on the back of an envelope that he found on the floor, pulls off his tall hat, pulls out a pencil and writes it on the back of the envelope. Obviously, it was false, but for so many people, this is before my time, I don't think I had to read it, but that short story became a requirement in grade school. So when you have hundreds and thousands of people reading this, not as a novel, but as something that was fact, it found its way into our vernacular and our history. Right. But definitely incorrect. There is no way that he could have ever, I mean, if anybody's been on a Civil War era train, you know you're bouncing around, you're not writing anything. And you also know that Lincoln was he was very sociable, and he had a lot of associates with him, and he's having a good old time, you know, cracking jokes and kidding around with his friends. So he's got more important things to do at that point than to write the Gettysburg Address on his hat.
Right. And he's a careful planner too, I think, from what we know about Lincoln. And I think there's pretty good evidence that these, at least this initial draft of the Gettysburg Address was worked out pretty heavily in Washington before Lincoln even left for Gettysburg. And he, it makes me wonder, and I think there's a couple questions to this effect, but, did Lincoln, was he aware of how brilliant this was at the time? I think we know what the public reception was, and there's quite a few questions about that. But I've always wondered if Lincoln knew that he had really hit the mark with this speech.
There are some quotes from contemporaries who recall him actually bemoaning the speech, thinking that it could have been so much better, that he really wanted to convey more, that he was really not satisfied with it, which is really ironic when you think about it.
Yeah, that's true. And I did not know that. That's fascinating that he felt that it hadn't quite done what he thought he needed to do. So let me get into a couple. Actually, we already talked about the myth. There's a couple questions about the myth. And when Lincoln gets here, we actually have a question from Jim. He's asking, what's your take on the claim that Abe early on the 19th took a quick tour of part of the battlefield?
There is some indication that he may have with Secretary of State Seward.
Right.
This would have actually been before breakfast. And the thinking is that he probably finished the address that evening, the evening that he arrived on the 19th. And either it was that he didn't have time to finish it, or more likely, he just wanted to be at Gettysburg to finish it. He wanted to feel the environment.
Right.
And supposedly, one view is that he actually went out to the area where John Reynolds was killed,
right,
in as one describes it, a springless buckboard with Seward, which, isn't that far out of town, and then came back at breakfast, changed into his clothing, and got ready for the procession. And I do believe that he did, because the procession was not going to start until 10. Mm-hmm. Now, he probably didn't get a lot of sleep that night because there was a lot of stuff going on outside his window. Right. When you have almost 15,000 people and so few beds, you got a lot of people who are just hanging around, singing and dancing, and bands playing, etc. But he had plenty of time before the procession began. And quite frankly, if I'm the president, I'm going to go out on the battlefield. I'm going to go see it and experience it. And I think that may have added to what people, what they perceived of him, the sadness that they perceived when he went out there and he saw the freshly dug graves, and he saw where Reynolds was killed. And you really have to see it and experience to understand. You can't read it in a book, obviously, or a telegram.
Right. That's a great point. Well, why don't we get into a couple of the other kind of little known facts of who was here with Lincoln? Because a lot of I have a couple questions I just saw come through about that. So the people that were surrounding him during these events, one person in particular that someone submitted the question earlier asking about was his African-American valet, William Johnson, who was here at the Wills House with Lincoln. Can you talk a little bit about Johnson and maybe some of the others that were in Lincoln's entourage?
Yeah, well, let me talk about some of the others. Lincoln was very disappointed that he wanted his entire cabinet to come. But Seward came, and I apologize, one other, it wasn't even an important position. It wasn't postmaster, but it was one other cabinet secretary came, and that was it. He invited Meade to come. Right. Meade begged off. Meade was a little busy at the time. Yeah, right. But it's interesting because on the train with him was Edward Everett's daughter, hitched a ride on his train along with her husband. The minister of France and Italy were also on the train.
Yep.
Yeah. So he had a lot of his associates on that train as well. People that he felt comfortable with. It was a pretty full train, And it was several cars. He actually got it from John Garrett, who was the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. It was his personal car that he lent to Lincoln. So Lincoln had a lot of company with him as he got there. William Johnson is a fascinating story. This is a man who was a person of color. He was a barber by trade. And when Lincoln, before Lincoln was elected president, when Lincoln was riding the circuit, he would go over to William Johnson's barbershop and would get his haircut there. And they had a similar personality. They would tell each other jokes. And when Lincoln became president, he said, "Hey, William, how about coming to the White House or the executive mansion? I'll give you a job." And he said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." He had some problems in the White House with some of the other staff members. And Lincoln was kind of distressed, so he pulls him out of the White House, gets him a job in the Treasury Department. So I don't know if it was Lincoln. Lincoln obviously could take care of himself, but he apparently wanted someone to come with him who could really be almost, as you mentioned, Andrew, a personal valet. He wasn't normally his valet. But when you think about where that bedroom up on the second floor of the Wills house, he was there with William Johnson. William Johnson probably slept in the same bed with him that night.
Wow.
William Johnson is going to go downstairs and get a piece of paper from David Wills to finish the Gettysburg Address. So they were very close friends. And one of the issues, and we may not get to it, but when Lincoln comes back, he probably caught what Tad had and was bedridden for several weeks. And William Johnson's going to take care of him. The problem is in January, William Johnson comes down with a full-blown case of smallpox and is going to die.
Wow.
And I can't even imagine. Lincoln probably knew that he got him sick and probably led to his demise. And I can't even imagine how he felt about that. He made sure that he was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. One of the first civilians, may have been the first civilian to actually been buried there.
Wow.
So it's a fascinating story. We don't have a photograph of him, but we do have photographs of his gravestone. It says William Johnson, citizen. And but that's all we really have of him at this point.
That is fascinating. And along those lines, in terms of the folks that were around Lincoln, someone asked about security and whether security was a concern and how it was handled. And before you answer that, I just want to point out one other artifact that I brought over here. These are signatures that were collected by David Wills' daughter from some of the dignitaries that were there for the Gettysburg Address. And one of the signatures that she got is Ward Hill Layman. And I, of course, Ward Layman is somebody who you talk about quite a bit in the book. So maybe you could touch on his role and overall, how the President of the United States is guarded in this, really important moment.
Yeah. Well, he had a militiaman, a soldier outside of his door during his stay here. So, and when Lincoln did leave the Wills house during the evening, I mean, it was late in the evening of the 18th, he wanted to go next door to see William Seward and basically go through the Gettysburg Address with him, maybe to practice it with him. And the guard came with them just to make sure that that Lincoln was fine. Layman's an interesting guy. He's an attorney. In the book, I talk about opposites. These two guys were completely opposites in everything, in terms of appearance, in terms of personality, but they really took a strong liking to each other. And they would ride the circuit together. Probably stay in the same room, probably stay in the same bed when they were attorneys together. When Lincoln becomes president, he becomes Marshal of the District of Columbia. And you'll see Ward Layman in many cases standing very close to the president when there's a receiving line or when he's moving around from place to place, basically providing protection. But that's not why Ward Layman was here, though.
Right.
It was not to protect the president. He became sort of the grand marshal. David Wills was a very shrewd guy. And when I look at his house and I think about him, I just think about how much he achieved and what it took for him to achieve what he achieved. I mean, as the agent for the state of Pennsylvania, it was just amazing where if you lost a loved one or you hadn't heard from a loved one, you went to David Wills and he was going to spend time being an investigator looking to find out, was your loved one wounded? If he was, where was he? If he was killed, maybe where his grave was. But one of the things that David Wills did was he knew that, or he learned that Ward Layman was very, very organized, number one. And number two, he was very close to the president. And while there were Democrats on the committee that planned the consecration ceremony who did not want Lincoln to come, Wills wanted Lincoln to come. He definitely wanted him to come. And he thought, okay, if I can get Ward Layman to be an integral part of the ceremony, maybe he can get Abraham Lincoln to come. And in fact, that's what happened. So Layman is really going to organize the procession and make sure that it's going to be as smooth as possible. He was also the master of ceremonies during the consecration ceremony as well. Interesting guy.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on, I think you've already answered a few questions kind of by accident, but somebody mentioned, did Lincoln visit Seward at 11 p.m. to change the Gettysburg Address? And I guess we don't really know what exactly was talked about, but presumably they did go over the speech. I do love that account. Of course, when Lincoln is walking across the pathway in front of the Wills house over to where Seward is staying, I think he's kind of crouched over, holding onto the coat of his bodyguard, the soldier that's assigned to him, and kind of weaving through the crowd so that he's not swarmed. So you can imagine the president of the United States kind of in the darkness, hiding behind this soldier. He's a towering figure, but he's crouched down, holding onto this guy's coat, trying to get through the crowd to visit Seward. So that's a remarkable story. And I have another artifact related to that. Actually, this is the order issued to send a soldier to guard Governor Horatio Seymour of New York on November 19th. So that's the original order that was sent as a dispatch, basically to detach an orderly to stand guard with the governor. So there are just so many artifacts and stories like that are fascinating. A couple questions, they're coming in really fast, so I'll try to get as many as I can. Someone's asking, this one might be easy to answer, but do we know what Lincoln ate at the Wills house? That's a tough one. That might be I have to ask Tim Smith that question. He could probably, what ingredients were put into the biscuits.
I think that's a Tim Smith answer.
Yeah, I do. I don't know if you know the answer to that. We do know there was a huge banquet at the Wills house. And there were many, many people there. And then the following day, there was another reception where crowds of people came, and Lincoln personally shook hands and greeted probably hundreds of people. And we do have some accounts of, little kids that were there looking up, and the president, talked to them and interacted with them. By all accounts, I think Lincoln was very good with kids and just in general, very good at talking.
Oh, yes. Well, it's interesting. Imagine Catherine Wills,
right,
who is 8 months pregnant with her. So she's got 3 kids. This is her 4th kid on the way. And her husband, David, says, oh, by the way, the president is coming, and about 35 or so others are going to be here for supper. And then the following, after the consecration ceremony, they go back for lunch, and they'll have, well, I guess it's dinner at that point. And after that, then they're going to have the reception. What I always tell people when I give the tour is, I wonder how many people contracted variola, which is what he had while he was here. But it's hard to imagine. If you think about the Wills house, you've got the front door on York Street, you got the side door on the square, and imagine Lincoln, there's a long line down York Street. They're coming up, the line is moving very slowly. You go up the steps, and there's the president right there at the front door. You go through David Wills's home, you go through his office, and as you're exiting the side door, there's Governor Curtin. You get to shake his hand as well.
Wow. That is amazing. And you're right. I don't think she gets enough credit, Mrs. Wills, for all that she did, Catherine Smizer Wills, and being, 8 months pregnant, in addition to hosting dozens of visitors, hundreds of people coming through her home. She has to basically take care of two large meals, and she has Edward Everett, Andrew Curtin, and the President of the United States at these banquets.
Yes.
So. I see we keep getting beeps because people are donating and sending us stars. That's very kind. Thank you so much
That's
for
great.
donating. You can hit that heart button at the bottom and donate to help the Historical Society. Another question here. Actually, two questions about the railroad car and the train, which is kind of going back chronologically in time. But Jim is asking a second question, who asked the question earlier. What happened to the railroad car that Lincoln rode in? He's asking if it was destroyed somehow, or if it exists anywhere. I don't know if I have an answer I don't know the answer to that question. It's a tough one.
It's a very tough, Jim, you're asking tough questions here.
That's all right.
I'm going to admit ignorance to that one, but let me just tell you how difficult it was to get from Washington to Gettysburg,
Right.
because there was no direct route.
Right.
You went from Washington to Baltimore. The cars were unhitched from the locomotive. They were dragged across Baltimore to another train line, hooked up there to Hanover Junction, where again the same process. So you had actually two changes, and we're spoiled today. We're used to trains, Acellas, et cetera, but these trains broke down all the time, number one. Number two, oftentimes there'd be cows that would just wander on the tracks, and suddenly the train is derailed. In fact, it's interesting, even though Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, was not coming, he took it upon himself to plan the itinerary for Lincoln. And he said, I know you've got a sick child, and I know you're really busy. How about if I get you on a train first thing on the 19th, the day of the consecration, and we get you back that night, and nobody even knows you're gone because it's only been one day. And Lincoln, as shrewd as he is, says, you know what? I know about these railroads. Can you imagine if something happens and I get there at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and the ceremony is over? I can't afford to do that. So that's why he's going to come the day before, coming in about 6 o'clock in the evening, just to make sure that he's going to be there at that event.
Wow. Yeah, that is fascinating. I never really thought about that before. But we do, I think people are asking too about the train schedules. We do have some records from the train station in Gettysburg, including some of the original train schedules from around that time. So those are always fascinating to look at. Since you mentioned earlier the procession, I thought we might talk about that for a little bit. The large procession in the National Cemetery, which was extensively photographed. And I'm sure many of you have seen these images of Baltimore Street with the crowd coming down and then turning onto Steinmore Avenue. I wanted to, since you alluded to this, I wanted to show probably one of the rarest items we have in our collection, which is an original program from the Gettysburg Address. Let me take it out of this glossy sheet just so you can get a little bit of a better look at it. But this is one of the only a few, maybe a handful of programs from the Gettysburg Address that still exist. And it lists the order of the procession down Baltimore Street. The Chief Marshal, then the President of the United States, members of the cabinet. It also lists the judges of the U.S. Supreme Court, who I do not believe were there. It goes on. And like you said, a lot of these people, including George Meade, who's listed here, were not able to attend. But these programs were printed locally, and actually this one, some local business owner used it as scrap paper and put all of his notes on it. So kind of a fascinating piece that we're lucky to have here at the Historical Society.
And Andrew, if there's one thing I wish I could have changed, is to have that blown up in the book. I have a little graphic of it, but that left sheet that talks about the procession, that was all about Ward Layman.
Right.
And you see how organized he was. Even the states, if you look at the states, it starts with Pennsylvania, and then it's the other states, and then it's the territories, and then DC. Very, very specific in terms of who is going to form where in this procession. And then on the right side is the actual consecration ceremony. What comes first? What's going to come after that, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing to see that, and then look at these photographs. And actually, there's a photograph in William A. Frasnito's book that purports to show Lincoln on his horse in the crowd. If you zoom in really close, and you can see the marshals with their sashes next to him on either side. So, it is just remarkable to look at the series of photographs that we have. And of course, it's kind of remarkable, perhaps not given the technology of the day, but there's no close-up image of Abraham Lincoln in Gettysburg. And much to the detriment of our books and historians trying to talk about these events, we really don't have a really excellent close-up image of Lincoln. But in this procession, I think that's probably the closest we get to seeing him, other than the very famous photo from a distance of him sitting on the platform. Right. But could you talk a little bit about, we have a question actually about the horse that Lincoln rode on. I'm sure you figured that would come up, but
I was hoping it would.
Yeah. Would you like to talk about that story?
I would be delighted. It really relates to the political divisions that we had at the time. We think today that the Democrats and the Republicans do not get along very well. It was just as bad back then. And so much of the ceremony, whether the horse that Lincoln was on, how good the speech was, it really relates to whether it was a Democrat or a Republican relaying the story. The Democrat, well, one of the stories was first of all, there were no buggies or wagons in the procession. Either you walked or you rode on a horse. That was it. John McClellan, who owned the Franklin Hotel, now the Gettysburg Hotel, he provided the horse. And one version was it was the smallest horse, almost like a pony, that someone had ever seen. He looked, and they used actually the words ridiculous and silly. His feet almost touched the ground. And the reason for it was, well, Lincoln didn't know how to ride a horse. So, if he fell off the horse, he's not going to get as hurt because he's closer to the ground. Well, that's kind of silly, because we know that Lincoln, he may not have been a great horseman, but he certainly could ride a horse. We know that. He rode through Washington all the time to a summer cottage. At the other extreme was the most magnificent, biggest, blackest steed you can ever imagine. And you can imagine it relates directly to whether it was a Democrat or a Republican telling the story. The Democrats were going to be much more negative about everything that Lincoln did. Even Lincoln coming to Gettysburg was a fight between the Republicans and the Democrats. So it continued on well past his visit here to Gettysburg.
Right. That's a great point. You're right. The truth often lies in the middle with some of these stories, even back then. I'm glad you touched on that. I did want to point out, actually, we have a viewer tonight, Anne, who says she is the great-great-granddaughter of Andrew Curtin. So she's excited to hear you talk about that.
He's quite
Andrew
a guy.
Curtin.
He's one of my heroes.
Yep. And I think that she's asking if you talk about Curtin in the book, and I would say you talk about Curtin quite a bit in the book. So
that's right.
Definitely worth checking that out. She also asked how tall Lincoln was. Do we know the precise height?
Well, supposedly 6'4".
Okay. Yeah. That's amazing.
And he didn't have stilts or lifts on his shoes.
Well, I think anyone that tall might look a little bit big on a horse.
Yes.
in that day and age. So perhaps that was closer to the truth. But so getting to the actual ceremony, we have some questions about that as well. Of course, Edward Everett is the keynote speaker, and he's a prominent politician, orator of his time, very well known. I think people don't really realize how well known he was, and served in various offices. I think he was a congressman, a senator, and also a cabinet secretary.
Secretary of State. He was president of Harvard University.
Wow.
He was not prime minister, but he was the, what do you call that? He went to England, and he was our representative there. I'm blanking, but ambassador. Thank you.
That's right.
So, I mean, if there was a position that he could have filled, he did fill it. So he was a superstar of the age. And people don't realize that whenever you had a major ceremony, you wanted to get an orator, and the bigger the better. And there was nobody more famous than Edward Everett, 69 years old, with a booming baritone voice. People wanted to come out and they wanted to see him. And they actually delayed the ceremony, the timing of the ceremony, to adjust to Edward Everett's schedule. He couldn't come in October when they wanted to do it. And think about it. He says, well, I can do it mid-November. Well, it could have snowed. It could have been very cold.
Right. Right.
This is not an indoor event. And they bit the bullet and they said, well, he is so important to us. We think that it's worth the risk. And they lucked out. They call it almost like an Indian summer day. It was such a nice day, probably in the 60s. Just a beautiful day, that particular day.
Wow. That's fascinating. And we have, so Everett's speech, of course, goes on for at least 2 hours. And I think that people are getting a little restless at that point. We do have a question, though. So Everett wraps up, and there's this famous story that kind of, maybe you could speak to the truth of it, that the cameras are set up to photograph Lincoln, but his speech is so short that by the time they're ready to take the photograph, he's finished the speech and has already sat back down. And that's the photograph that we know so well today. Do you think that story is true?
No, I do think that it was fast. Most people didn't realize it, but I don't think that the actual photograph was him in the middle of the ceremony. It was either before or after, probably before, as people getting settled. Right. There are a lot of, it seems like a lot of people walking around on stage, standing up. So I don't get that impression. But this was David Will's work. He was the one who, I mean, he did so much. He studied different consecration ceremonies. What should they be composed of? So there were 3 major components: the prayers, the music, and the oration and the dedication. Right. And so what happened was, after Edward Everett got up, sat down, and by the way, supposedly Lincoln really liked, at least he was very complimentary. He thought it was much better than his own remarks, maybe if he's looking at longevity. But there was an ode in between the two. And so, but the ode was very short. And you're right, a lot of people, they wandered off, they're chatting, they're taking a little nap, etc. And, you know, they thought, well, there'd be time for him. He was going to give a longer speech. And you know, I always think about this. If I'm president of the United States and I get a letter from David Wills that says a few appropriate remarks, I think I'm going to do whatever I want. You know, if I want to go 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to go 15, 20 minutes, for goodness sakes. I'm not going to listen. Well, Lincoln, you know, respected what was asked. And so, you know, it was over very, very quickly, you know, under 300 words.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And that kind of gets into the questions about the speech itself. We had a couple, you know, I think someone's asking, this is a very broad question, but maybe you could, this is actually kind of a good question I have a couple more I want to ask you, but we'll package them together. Why does this address still resonate with people so much? I think the meaning, obviously, at the time, you know, was one of unity and staying the course, and kind of hearkening back to the founding principles of the nation, which was brilliant. I think relating those principles to the struggle of the time. But today, I think still it's amazing how many people still recite the Gettysburg Address, visit here. There's a pilgrimage to this site to see where this speech was given. So maybe you could talk just about your own personal thoughts on why the Gettysburg Address is still so important today.
Well, I think you hit it on the nail, Andrew, in terms of it still resonates, you know, whenever there is a war, relating to the sacrifice, but equally important, just the beauty of the prose. I mean, how he was able to, in such a short statement, convey this information. The beauty of it is truly amazing. And I've written a number of books, and I say to myself, wow, I wish I could write like that. I think that also had a major role to play, the way he turned the phrases as well as what they meant. And, and oftentimes you read it and you really have to sit back and ponder exactly what he was getting. You have to work it a little bit as well to really understand all of the meanings.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's hard to imagine too. We don't know what Lincoln's voice sounded like. We have accounts of it, but it's always fascinating for me to read. And I'll give a short plug for, we have hundreds of accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg and Lincoln's address here by civilians at the Historical Society. But I love the ones that really get at the essence of what he sounded like and what he, how he carried himself and those types of things. What are your insights from all of your research on this about, the character of the speech, not just the words of it?
Yeah. Well, he definitely, without any question, was very solemn, very morose, almost very depressed,
right,
as you'd expect. Number one. Number two, his voice was tended to be higher pitched. Some would say thin, and I don't know about this, but they said because it was higher pitched, it was able to reach the furthest extension of the crowd. If there are 15,000 people in that area without a microphone, I can't imagine that a large number actually heard the speech. One thing that, and I probably shouldn't say this, but there were many, many people who left recollections 40, 50, 60 years after the event, talking about it as though it was yesterday. And, yes, it was a seminal event. Yes, they probably remember more because it was a seminal event. But when I read something and it's more than a decade or two old, I start to say, oh, so we spent a lot more effort looking at newspapers and diaries and letters from that period where they weren't influenced. I mean, think about it, Andrew. Imagine you were 8 years old and you were at Gettysburg, and you can go through your life saying, I shook Lincoln's hand. Whether you did or not, you suddenly become much more special than anything you've ever done.
That's right.
And there were a lot of people who, I mean, if you read about all the people that exchanged words with Lincoln, that he patted on the head, there would be hundreds and thousands, more than were there.
Right.
So that became an issue. And you raise a very good point. Even the way he gave the address is contradictory. You had people there, John Hay, and by the way, John Hay, who's one of his personal secretaries, did not think much of Lincoln's address initially. He actually wrote after he thought that Edward Everett's was much more profound and much more important than Lincoln's. It really baffles me that someone so close to Lincoln would have felt that way. But even how he delivered it, did he memorize the speech? Did he read the speech? Did he look down at the speech? You have people that were there who were writing soon after with very different conflicting opinions on and observations of what actually happened. And even did they applaud? Think about it. It's almost like a funeral. Do you applaud when the president has completed his remarks? And there are some who said, oh, no. In fact, Nicolay, as I recall, said, no, he was in the front row. He says, there was no applause. But there was a reporter from the Associated Press who is taking down every word. And when you read all the newspapers, from Ohio and Illinois and New York, they were usually using this person's transcription, and everything was the same. It was perfect to what was actually on the first version of the address that says Executive Mansion at the top. But at the end of each paragraph where he paused, it says applause. Right. Applause. And at the very end, it says a sustained applause. So it's a question mark, but I believe that if I had to pick, I would go with someone who is on stage, maybe 10 feet away from the president, writing down every word and getting the essence of it that he's going to share with, nationally.
Right.
So that there's so much. And what we tried not to do is to say, here are all the possibilities. This is the one.
Right.
As much as here are all the possibilities and all the evidence, you decide,
Yeah.
because we'll
That's
never
true.
really know.
Yeah, and that's just wonderful too when in books you present all the different varying accounts. You can never expect a historian or a writer of history. You should never want them to only present one possible outcome when we really don't know the answer to some of these questions. And I've also thought along the lines of what you just said, it's kind of remarkable that the exact site of the Gettysburg Address is not marked. I mean, that I think speaks to the solemn feeling and the idea that the speech wasn't the real, the factor. It was what had happened and what the speech was about. And it wasn't really that important to mark that exact spot where Lincoln had stood and delivered the speech. But do you have any thoughts on why that it wasn't? Obviously it's in the middle of Evergreen Cemetery, so that might be the answer to the question. But I think a lot of people have asked me, and maybe they've asked you too, why isn't there a marker right at the scene of the platform?
Well, I wish I could say it was as cut and dry as people think, because right after, we're talking 5 years after, 1870 or so, when the cornerstone of the Soldiers Monument was being laid, there were reporters there who indicated, who had also been at the the dedication ceremony, who said the platform was right where that monument was. That's what they wrote. And for years, that's what we all believed. And people started saying, but wait a minute, wouldn't all these individuals who were spectators be tromping on some of the graves that had been freshly dug? And then there was another guy, I think his name was Selleck from Wisconsin, who was on the platform, who said, no, it was definitely not Evergreen Cemetery. This is even before Evergreen Cemetery was thought of. It was over at a different part of the cemetery. So here you had, until fairly recently, people thinking that it was somewhere within the National Cemetery. And then it was Kathy George who, worked for the Park Service. She looked at these photographs and she said, there's no way, looking at the photographs, looking at the Evergreen Cemetery gatehouse, that it could have been within the cemetery. It had to have been, probably in the Evergreen Cemetery, probably near where the Jenny Wade grave is. Right. So part of it could be that we don't know exactly. I mean, it probably was in the cemetery, in the Evergreen Cemetery, but do we know exactly where we can say it is? Probably not. We can say in this general area, and that may have been part of it.
Right. Yeah. It is amazing that it isn't marked exactly where the platform is located. So I'll ask you one last question, and then I'll get into, I saved one question for the end for selfish reasons about the Historical Society in our collection. But someone asked what your favorite part of the story is in researching and writing the book. Was there one part of Lincoln's visit that you found appealing in one way or another? I'm going to answer the question first. In terms of stories from the Gettysburg Address, I wanted to comment on this earlier, but when you mentioned all the obituaries that mentioned shaking hands with Lincoln, Tim Smith here at the Historical Society once showed me the obituary of a gentleman, I think, who was 6 months old at the time of the Gettysburg Address, whose obituary stated he shook hands with Lincoln. So there's you're right about that. People's desire to kind of put themselves very close to Lincoln. So yeah, is there anything that really stuck out to you? Maybe, just a story that you hadn't been familiar with that you dug into and maybe, felt that it was just really compelling.
It's so interesting because we learned so much during our exploration. Obviously, when you have this length of a book, it's not going to be exhaustive. I think we did a pretty good job. I would say for me, what was most interesting is how much we don't know. How much controversy there is in terms of even where it was written, the Gettysburg Address, how he looked, how he delivered it, the horse he was riding in. Was he, how sick was he? We know he was very sick, but was he, I think he was starting to show signs, overt signs of illness while he was still in Gettysburg. One of the interesting stories also is about John Burns, and after the ceremony, after lunch, after he meets with everyone, this is a man who didn't get a lot of sleep, who's probably not feeling very well. He goes to the Presbyterian Church, not so much to worship. It was a political rally, the state of Ohio, as you know, Andrew. And he wants to go with a national hero, and that's John Burns. And that's an interesting story. But one of them falls asleep. And everyone says, well, it has to be John Burns because he's almost 70 years old. So it had to be John Burns. And I'm thinking, okay, that's possible. But if I haven't slept very much and I've been under a lot of stress and I'm coming down with variola, which is a mild form of smallpox, I think there's a good chance Lincoln might have fallen asleep. That doesn't really matter. But again, so much, that's what makes history so fascinating. It's not cut and dry. We don't know exactly. And as you know, Andrew, you're seeing all the time, you're always getting tidbits. Right. And new pieces of information that helps fill in the gaps, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, it's like solving a puzzle. And I think what's amazing about history is we can use our mind's eye and take these things. And as we're reading them, it's just coloring in different details of these incredible events that, we could never get from anything else. We're reading the words and seeing the words of the people who are actually there. So that brings me to the question. Someone asked how many artifacts we have at the Historical Society related to the Gettysburg Address. And boy, that is a hard question to answer. We have probably, I would say, dozens of items that belong to eyewitnesses that they left behind, including letters, diaries. We have records like the program from the ceremony, which is pretty remarkable. And we have some items that belong to John Burns, who was involved in the ceremony. We have one of his rifles. We have a cane that was given to him to honor his service. And a couple items that Edward Everett sent to David Wills. But I think the largest body of information we have about the Gettysburg Address here is we have a collection that belonged to the Wills family. So we have items that were in the Wills house. We have all of David Wills' law books that were in his office that Lincoln may have, perused as he was, in that room during their stay. So I could go on and on and on about that. But what you'll have to do is visit us next year when we open our new museum, and you can see an entire exhibit about Lincoln's visit that will have all these artifacts and stories and images. And our new museum, Gettysburg Beyond the Battle, opens in early next year, probably February or March of next year. So you'll have to come and see those items. They've never been displayed before, so we just can't wait to share them with you. And I'm sure we'll have Brad back to give another program in our event center that we're building out there as well. So thank you all so much for your great questions. And I just want to thank Brad again. This book is fascinating. It is a wonderful way, to take a dive into this event without having to read a 1,000-page volume. There's lots of images and maps, and it's just, as everything that Brad and Linda do, it's just so easy to digest and to understand. And the storytelling is just fascinating. So I hope you'll check that book out. And I also want to thank everybody who donated. If you want to support our programs and support our grassroots operation here in Gettysburg and our capital campaign to build a new museum, I hope you'll hit the donate button tonight before you sign off. Every dollar, of course, makes a big difference for us. So thank you again, Brad, for being with us tonight. And I think we're all excited to learn more and to read the book. And I hope you'll come back and speak about this again.
It'll be my pleasure. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you all for being part of this evening's event. And one of the good things about the book, and what I was very impressed about, is they were able to price it in a way that was attractive, so it wasn't a hardship like many books are. So if you're interested in Lincoln and Gettysburg and the cemetery, pick it up. And thank you, Andrew. Thank you for what you do to really enlighten all of us about this very important place called Gettysburg.
Thank you, Brad. All right, well, we'll be back next week with another program. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.